All right, hello. Thank you for being here. Of course, I encourage you to like and subscribe. But I'm just thinking about this one concept here. Here, talking about space, right? Empty space, and of course, you know, we think about the great distances that are in space, right, between objects in space, I should say. And just thinking about all the neighbors we could potentially have just in this one galaxy alone, the Milky Way. You think about all the swaths of streams of stars that, even though they're at very great distances, an average of, I guess, 4 light years each, right, on average, but certainly that's a very random thing, right? But you think about stars being, you know great distances that, you wouldn't think that humanity might even ever be able to overcome, and maybe even other civilizations that maybe exist, who knows, right? But just thinking about, wow, just all the spiral arms of a different galaxies, and different galaxies that aren't even spiral galaxies, right? And just it's just unfathomable to think about how much space is involved, right? How distant these places, these neighbors of ours might be, right? We think about Proxima B and Alpha Centauri, right? And whatever other ones, beyond that, I don't know all the names of the stars, but I'm just saying, you know, that's just such a very tiny little local group. But, you can imagine, like, just when we look at the imagery that we see and maybe some photographs, I don't know exactly which ones are real or not and all that, but it seems to be legit that there really are these massive galaxies, and we are in one, right? We are in the Milky Way, which is, I think, considered to be a pretty sizable galaxy with up to half a trillion stars, right? Half a trillion stars that, many of them are like the sun, right? You think, wow, well, certainly some of them have, a lot of the same materials, a lot of the same chemistries that Earth would have, or the sun has here. And you think, wow, I mean, but at the same time, you think, wow, in our solar system, it's like Earth's the only one. There's this habitable zone, water, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, all the stuff that needs to be in that habitable zone, potentially for life to exist, right? Wow, isn't it incredible to think that a tiny microbial organism possibly could have developed into us? It's almost unfathomable, right? And to think that that could have maybe happened somewhere else, right? On its own, abiogenesis. It's got its own origins, right? It's almost unfathomable, but at the same time, the space is so large. You think about the galaxy, just with half a trillion suns, or not maybe suns, but you get a half a trillion stars, many suns. I don't know what the percentage is exactly, but maybe 20% or something like that, or similar to the sun. I don't know, but you get the idea, right? A lot of suns that, have the heat levels that we're at here at some certain distance from that sun, and certainly there could be material in that level, that distance from those suns, those stars. And then, but then you also think, wow, just from a large perspective, just thinking about just passing by a galaxy, how many potential sentience could exist in that galaxy, right? How much sentient beings could potentially exist, how much consciousness could be in that, how much awareness, how much influence might be in that galaxy that's a result of sentience. I mean, it's almost unbelievable, right? It is unbelievable. It's just, but what are the odds that we would exist right here and right now? How is it that we manage to maintain, from our perspective, seemingly so long, in in the chaos that seems to exist in space, right? How do we seem to maintain here so long? At the same time, you think, wow, our time span is nothing compared to the existence of our planet, the existence of many species that have even come before us, and the idea that, the dinosaurs ruled the world 65 million years ago. Like, the humankind is up to maybe a couple 100,000 years or something in that range, right? You think, wow, it's 65 million years ago. That's a long time ago compared to our existence. I mean, you think that all kinds of, like all the stuff that's happened on the Earth, regardless of our existence, implies that things are happening elsewhere regardless of our existence, maybe, potentially, in a way. Like, not necessarily, like, maybe we're from the same DNA as all the creatures on Earth, but just in the terms of, the idea of a completely different era, I guess, and from, at least from our perspective, it's 65 million years ago, right? And if you look at the planetary perspective of Earth allegedly being up to about 4 billion years old, 65 million years is nothing, right? Well, say nothing, but close to nothing, right? So even that, at least a huge span of time before that, you think about all these different periods of supposedly evolutionary biological development, that all these different creatures have existed, but it took all this time to get to seemingly a relatively small population of, creatures that became human beings, right? Like, that became us. What are the odds of that? And that we could get to the point of contemplating our existence and the purpose of it to this degree. I mean, it's pretty crazy, right? I mean, what other creature is able to do that? Or is there another creature that is able to do that? Maybe even on this planet. Maybe we don't understand ways in certain animals think, or some creature that we haven't even discovered yet, maybe on this planet thinks, right? Who knows, right? So, there's so much to learn, but, you think about, what is the way of the thinking of a creature on another planet? The idea that maybe life could come from some kind of different way of, like, a silicone, robotics, electronics, whatever, electronic, whatever, like, we got electronic pulses in our body, so it's not like, maybe we're in the way somehow, the result of that, some electrical pulse, electrical surge, that somehow life arose because of this combination of chemistry and electrical surge or something, who knows. But thinking about, wow, the galaxies, that they're so big that, you see a galaxy and you see all these little swaths of dust essentially off the side of a galaxy, and just way at the edge of a galaxy, and there's sun there, it could have heat, and some, planet could exist there, but it's just, we're like, I don't know, 2/3 of the way out towards the edge of our galaxy, the Milky Way, right? It's like a kind of a flat disk idea is the idea, and we're in one of the spiral arms towards the edge, not totally at the edge, but like, maybe 2/3 of the way out, if I'm correct. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but you get the idea, right? We're just in a random place, if you will. And, is there places in the galaxy where life couldn't exist for certain reasons? The radiation's too high or something like that? Certainly, probably, right? Maybe if you're near the center of the galaxy, maybe there's a black hole there, and maybe there's just too many factors there that would make it impossible for life to exist, or maybe life would be completely different in a way. Maybe it was able to deal with the gravitational factors, the radiation factors, right? Stuff like that. Who knows? But yeah, thinking about flying by, if you were able to actually do it from, a ship, or maybe if you were a supersized creature, or maybe a smaller, I don't know, it's hard to, just right off the top of my head, but if you can imagine flying by a galaxy and looking and being able to just quickly scan and view all the planets around all those stars, how often would you be able to see something interesting, like a civilization, or even just life in general, right? Well, what are all the varieties of planets that exist? It's kind of like, wow, you think Jupiter, wow, such a huge planet. What could be done there? But then apparently not much, right? It's mostly a gas planet, or the surface for the most part seems to be all gas, or mostly gas. Who knows what the core is? I don't know exactly what they know. I'm not like up to date with all the latest research, but such a huge planet, right? You think, wow, what could be done with that? That's territory in some way, but can it be utilized? It's like a wasteland. It's like a vast wasteland in our solar system, right? Certainly a lot of that out there. We had to go and look at the galaxy and look at see each planet and all that stuff. You'd see a lot of vast wastelands, a lot of planets that would be just completely uninhabitable, at least for us. Maybe we're able to see some kind of other life forms on some other planet that would be, like so completely different because the landscape is, so different. It's not Earth-like, right? It's like something pretty different, right? But there's somehow some sentience there, modern, civilized or not, right? So anyway, this is just my random thoughts, just kind of rambling here, but just the thoughts of really, wow, how many civilizations you're potentially looking at when you look at one galaxy. Of course, the meaning of it all, who even knows, right? Who has a clue, right? We can say God. We can say some other arbitrary reasoning why we're here, why space is so vast, why, crime happens, why, there's good and evil, or bad or good, and whatever you want to label them, however you see them, whether you're secular, spiritual, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, whatever other religious views we might come up with, philosophies for it. Bottom line, we see what we see when we look to the stars, right? Seemingly vast quantities of space with vast but largely spaced out quantities of matter, right? And apparently, according to theory of whatever, just antimatter, whatever exactly it is, antimatter. The space is space itself really nothing, or is it something? Is there an end to space? Think about the end of the universe. Is it more intriguing the idea that the universe has an end, or more intriguing that it doesn't have an end? Right? Which one's more like mind-boggling, right? Which one raises more questions? The idea that space doesn't have an end. We talk about the Big Bang Theory, and maybe there's no center to space that we can identify, but if there's a Big Bang Theory, maybe there is some center to space that we don't understand. Maybe we can supposedly only see out so far. 46 billion light years in every direction, like a circle, if you like, a sphere, if you will. And why is that? Well, apparently the universe is expanding, even potentially faster than the speed of light at some point out there, and so we're not able to see the light beyond that point, right? So it could even be a little confusing when you think about it. But the idea that the universe is expanding, leaves a lot of questions, of course. What did it expand from? What did it come from? Was it infinitely small at one point? Was it an explosion, or was it a gradual, a foaming up, if you will? So there's all kinds of different speculations on that. Maybe Big Bang isn't even really the right way to look at it, right? Who knows? Maybe, so it's just a few thoughts. I'm just rambling here. Maybe let me know if you like thinking about these kind of things, or maybe you're the type that doesn't really think about this stuff that much because you don't really feel like it's so practical to your day-to-day life. And I get it. We go maybe through different modes. Maybe you like to think about science and discovery, but understand that it's such a slow-moving progress. It is a fast-moving progress in many ways. Technologies that we find practical to us. I think, development of cell phones and TV, stuff like that, stuff that people want for entertainment purposes, certainly. But when it comes to really making breakthroughs in science, it's a slow process. They do a lot of testing, a lot of discovery over time, right? Different research and development, and that's not just development really so much, more like just research, right? Because you're not necessarily thinking about making products out of it. You're thinking about making a new fundamental discovery or axiom or principle or and that's the idea behind some of the most major mathematicians and physicians or physicists, physicians. But yeah, so anyway, I'm just like talking about, really a wide range of things here. But, getting back to, the idea of, the idea that maybe humans aren't the only sentient creature, the word aliens, yeah, like aliens that come from outside, right? Think about it like that, but other biological creatures that could have developed to similar levels to us, maybe way beyond, who knows, right? I think it's pretty fascinating, just to think about that one galaxy alone, but at the same time, 2 trillion galaxies. There's 2 trillion galaxies out there. Is that right? That's the estimate, I think. 2 trillion galaxies. And, hundreds of billions of stars each, suns, all kinds of different shapes of galaxies. What are the ways in which these galaxies, could develop networks of sentient beings or creatures, could they be civilized across the galaxy with one species? How big could a species get? How small could an advanced species get, right? Maybe a tiny species is somehow way more advanced than us technologically. Is that possible? Seems like maybe there's some limitations there, right? We look at, what seems to exist here on Earth and what seems to be possible and why, because maybe molecular structures, etc. But still, I think there's a lot of stuff that's, left to be discussed in terms of the possibilities of, that kind of thing, like sizes, shapes of, beings. We look and we think, well, all stars seem to be round. All the planets that we apparently, are discovering or seem to be round or spherical, I should say, right? In the nature, generally speaking. So, in that sense, it seems that across the universe, it looks like these larger objects, such as stars, or whatever, black holes, but stars and planets seem to be spherical, right? So, we might ascertain from that there is some limitations to what exists in the universe on different levels. Maybe evolution and biology is the same way. Maybe it's within a certain constraint. Biology can only exist in the way that it does here on Earth, like microbial, soft shell biology, or whatever it is. You get the idea. Maybe not soft shell, but crustaceans and mammals, and insects and the different kinds of biology we have here, reptiles, etc., amphibians. So, anyway, I'm just rambling on and on here, not really going anywhere real specific about it, but I'm just thinking about how unfathomable it is, how big space seems to be at the least, right? But like I said, the idea of space being infinite. What if space is somehow infinite? Is that possible? Is it possible for space to go on for literally forever? There's just no end to space. No end to space. Can we imagine that? At the same time, there's an end to space. Obviously we can, what's beyond that? A true nothingness, right? What's beyond the end to space? A true nothingness beyond what we see as empty space here in the universe that we can observe, right? Or is, and I think the idea of a barrier, some kind of cosmic, radiation barrier, some warped area that, there's no space to, you just can't simply go, you can seemingly look through it. Maybe nothing exists out there. We don't see anything out there. You can seemingly, no barrier, but you just can't travel past it for some reason, right? So it's a magnetic field of some kind. Who knows? Anyway, so I don't know where I'm going with this. Like I said, I'm just rambling. So I appreciate you listening in. Maybe it went somewhere for you. Maybe you got something out of it. I don't know. Philosophical enrichment, or maybe it just inspiration to go look at science or cosmology more, or, astronomy. Just maybe get into the idea of learning more about the, you know, the galaxies. Just the galaxy. Just the idea that the Milky Way is just one galaxy out of trillions, but yet it is just, take us 100,000 light years to get across just the Milky Way. 100,000 light years. Wow. Anyway, like you said, just kind of rambling on here. Appreciate you listening in. Maybe we'll see you in the next video. Maybe there's something else here you want to check out. If not, maybe, we'll see you in the future in another video. I appreciate you listening in. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.